In the Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts of 1844, Marx gives his very famous account of alienation, of the ways in which the worker is alienated in what he'd later come to call in a capitalistic society. And in the course of laying out these four different senses of alienation, Marx makes these remarks about species being, about how our species being consists in a particular kind of productive activity, a social kind of productive activity. And you might also recall in On the Jewish Question, when Marx describes human emancipation, he's very brief about it, but what he says is that human emancipation consists in the individual becoming a species being, and that's going to be related to or going to involve or going to consist in individuals participating in social production. And so we've seen this idea of productive activity, this kind of productive activity that human beings are supposed to be engaging in, that it's supposed to be social in some way. And so that raises the question, what exactly is social production? And how exactly is it lacking in modern day society? Because that is something Marx clearly thinks. In the comments on James Mill, Marx addresses these questions. He tells us what social production is, and he tells us how it differs from the kind of production that we engage in capitalistic societies. Right? So that's what we're going to focus on. And Marx does this by drawing a distinction between two different kinds of production. And what he calls them here in the comments on James Mill, he calls them production under private property. That's the first one. And then he calls it human production. That's the second one. One of the things that we're going to see from Marx is that he switches up terminology. He doesn't keep a consistent set of terminology throughout his writing career. And that can be a little bit confusing the first time you read them, but it's not, I think, too hard to figure it out. Production under private property, that's essentially what Marx would call, or what Marx calls earlier, alienated labor. It's a kind of alienated labor. It's a little bit different, but it's basically the same kind of thing. Production, economic activity in a merely politically emancipated state, a state that's politically emancipated but hasn't achieved human emancipation. Those are all the same thing. In a merely political emancipated state, you're going to have alienated labor. That is to say, you're going to have production under private property, right? Those things all in one way or another refer to the same state of affairs. And then the contrast with those states of affairs also receive different names, if you will, different labels. So on the Jewish Question, and he calls it human emancipation. That's like the better alternative, the state that we can envision. And in the Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts, he doesn't really call it anything because he's focusing just on alienation, but you could just call it non-alienated labor. And you might wonder, right, after reading the Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts, what exactly would non-alienated labor look like? He's going to tell us here in the comments on James Mill. He's not going to call it non-alienated labor. Instead, he calls it human production. So human production is non-alienated labor. It's what people who have achieved human emancipation would do, right? And so that's what we're getting an account of. And so he's going to give us a further account of what exactly he means by species being, and how it is that we might achieve that, how that's related to our productive activity, and so on. Right? And so what we're going to do now is look at these two different kinds of production that he talks about. So first, production under private property. Marx addresses this, the way he introduces this in the comments on James Mill. He addresses it, you can think of it something like the following. You might think that the kind of production that we engage in today in a capitalistic society, you might think that it is social production. I mean, why think it's not? After all, what do people do in a capitalistic society? They make a bunch of products and then exchange it with each other. How is that not social, right? They're producing something and then exchanging it with other people. That's social, right? To give you an example, right? We're going to use this example as we proceed to kind of talk about how Marx is describing or viewing production under private property. Let's say I am I own an orchard, right? And I'm an apple orchard guy. And so I make a bunch of apples. I grow a bunch of apples. I don't make them, I guess. I grow them, right? And the apples that you see there, those are the apples that I'm going to use, right? So we have a somewhat basic society, if you will, right? We're not, I'm growing apples because I need to eat them. All that pile of apples, those are my apples. That's what I'm going to eat. That's what I need to live, or whatever. I'm going to use those. Those are for me. But look, and that's my private property, right? This is production on private property. Okay. But look, I might grow more apples than that, right? I might grow these 3 extra apples. Not because I'm going to use them, but because I plan to exchange them. Yeah. And so I got the big pile of apples. That's what I'm going to use. But then I grow some more. I don't just stop there. I keep growing some. Yeah. And likewise, let's say there's another guy over here that I run into in our whatever, our merely politically emancipated state, whatever you want to call it. And this guy is not a orchard guy. He whatever, has cows. Yeah, he gets the milk. He's a dairy farmer. There we go. Those 2 jugs of milk right there, that's what he's going to use, right? Just like I got my pile of apples for me that I'm going to use, he's got his milk that he's going to use, right? It's those 2 jugs right there. But he brought an extra jug with him. He's not going to use it. He doesn't need it. He brought it. He brought it to exchange, right? And so this is what would happen. This is a kind of very basic kind of a picture of what happens in today's society, right? We would then exchange our extra goods with each other. I produced extra apples so that I could exchange them with you and get the milk because I'd like some milk, but all I can grow are apples. So how am I going to get that milk? Well, I got to grow some extra apples. And so I give the apples to you, and then same thing with you, or whatever. That's not you, I guess, but that dairy farmer, you bottle some extra milk and exchange it, and okay, fine, right? That's production on private property. Why think that that's not social? After all, I've gone out of my way to grow more apples than I otherwise would have, and you've gone out of the dairy farmer's gone out of his way to bottle up more milk than he otherwise would have, right? Marx calls, so let's see why exactly Marx doesn't think of this as social production. So this is not social production. This is not the best way things could be, according to Marx. What happens, what we've just seen, is what Marx calls surplus production. In the example, we both engaged in surplus production. I produced more apples than I was going to need, than I was going to use. And the dairy farmer produced more milk than he was going to need or he was going to use, right? So we engage in surplus production. And you might think, well, look, and the reason that we engage in surplus production was to exchange with each other, right? Because I knew that dairy farmer was out there and that he wanted milk, and that dairy farmer knew that I was out there and he knew that he wanted apples. And so you might argue, well, look, there's surplus production under private property. We produce things. I keep producing more apples so that I can go exchange it with people. Doesn't that mean that there's social production, right? I am continuing to grow apples. The dairy farmer is continuing to bottle milk, even though we don't need those things. I don't need more apples. He doesn't need more milk. And so there's this kind of extra production that seems social, right? Yeah, I produced that initial pile of apples just for me, but then I produced the extra stuff for him. Why isn't that social production in Marx's sense? His idea is because this surplus production is entirely self-interested, right? And this should be, I don't think this idea is too hard to understand, right? I don't think what Marx is saying here is too hard to understand. The only reason that I make those 3 extra apples, say, is because I know that that's how I'm going to satisfy another interest of mine. I don't do it for the other guy. I don't really care about the other guy, the dairy farmer. The dairy farmer is just a kind of means for me to get the milk that I'm actually interested in, right? That's the idea. I view the dairy farmer as a mere means for milk. And I know that the only way that I can get that milk is if I grow these extra apples. And it's not just that I'm a self-interested jerk or whatever, or whatever. Maybe you don't think I'm being a jerk or whatever. I think Marx would think, whatever, it doesn't matter. But the dairy farmer's thinking that way too, right? The only reason he bottles the extra milk is because he wants those apples for him. And so that surplus production is ultimately self-interested. He doesn't make the extra milk for me. He makes it for him. He knows that he can exchange it. He can do something with it that turns it into apples, and he wants apples, right? And so it's ultimately all self-interested. This should bring to mind some of the things that Marx said about politically emancipated states on the Jewish question. He talked about how in civil society, it's the realm of self-interest, civil society, the kind of our economic lives. It's a realm of self-interest. Here's more specifically what he would mean by that, or an illustration or a reason why he would think that, because this is how exchange happens. It's self-interested. Moreover, and on the Jewish question, he talks about how in civil society we use each other as means, and we allow each other to be used. We allow ourselves to be used as means by others. Well, that's exactly what you see here. I'm allowing myself to be used as a means by the dairy farmer so that I can get whatever. I can satisfy my interests. I can further my interests. In this case, my interest being having some milk. And it's because of this self-interested using other people as means, you might think, that would entail that we're in some sense alienated from each other. I don't care about you for your sake. I care about you only because you serve me as a means. I'm ultimately interested in me. And this kind of self-regard, this overriding, overwhelming self-interest and self-regard is going to lead to alienation between us, right? And so you can see how a lot of Marx's ideas kind of come together here. This is production under private property. This is what life in civil society looks like. This is what a capitalistic society, a bourgeois society, to use a term he's going to use later, looks like. What we're going to turn to next is the alternative, how things could be better, what social production actually looks like, or to put it in the words of the phrase that Marx uses in the comments on James Mill, what human production looks like.